All right, welcome in to Friday Night Drive, the local recap, of course, of our semifinals, and what a semifinal round it was. We got a lot to talk about and plenty to dive into, so we're glad you're with us here as we get ready for the final week of the football season here in the state of Illinois. My name is Matt Rodewald. Glad you're with us this evening as we're taping this on Monday night. Steve Soucie is here. Boy, how was your weekend, young man?
A little adventurous, a little bit more so than I kind of expected that it would be. So definitely, kind of like you said, kind of a crazy weekend. When I looked back at it after it was all said and done, when you've got almost half of your semifinal games decided by a touchdown or less, you've had a pretty interesting weekend.
Yeah, and I would say that, for all those that look at the brackets and they say, well, why are they a one seed with not as much depth that, say, you and I have throughout the course of the year? I would say that the teams that were supposed to be there probably were there in the first place. And that showed you with the competitive games we saw everywhere that these are some great matchups, and we got some great brackets out of this. This turned out great this year.
Yeah, there were a lot of teams that, came out of different seed positions than maybe you were expecting, but ultimately when you kind of looked at it and you looked at heading into this weekend, I felt like there was the potential for a whole bunch of close games, and a lot of them came to fruition. Some of them did not. And then there were a few others that I did not think were going to be close games that turned into very much the case. So, it was just kind of a hodgepodge of things that ended up going on. And just as I expected, although the sources weren't what I expected, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on around 3:30, 4 o'clock when some of those 1 o'clock games were wrapping up. The 2 o'clock games were starting to show their shape. It was very, very interesting. I actually was so interesting in what was going on that my game that I chose at 1 o'clock kind of got away from things. So I left a little bit early to get to my next game. I actually ended up pulling off the road so I could follow along with some of the games that were closing up, because I obviously didn't want to take some reckless driving situation to find out what the score was in a semifinal game. So I pulled off, got some gas, and just sat there for about 15 or 20 minutes watching various things wrap up. So, that was basically my Saturday late afternoon.
So I got asked to do radio duty for DePaul Radio at the last second. Well, what time is that game? 4 o'clock. That takes me out of all of this. And there's the game at Geneva, of course, that I wanted to watch and go see in person. I didn't get a chance to do it. So I had it on the radio on my way. And then when the radio signal died, I made sure to get NFHS on, but I wasn't watching. So I was just trying to listen and try and, carry on. And I thought the crews did a nice job with that broadcast. But that was something I was paying attention to, but also kind of checking to see all the other games going on around 1 o'clock. I checked the East St. Louis score and said, well, that's decided. I mean, it took 2 seconds to kind of do that. But which one of the games that you were paying attention to that you thought was not going to be tight, which surprised you the most that was like, oh, this is a good one?
I think one of them that kind of surprised me a little bit was one that you just mentioned there, and it went in a different way. I was pretty confident that Cary Grove was going to win that football game against Geneva. And the fact that it was right there and Geneva was leading, a good portion of the way and just kind of trading it punch for punch and ended up winning that football game. That was the one that I was kind of monitoring, and it was giving me the reaction of, oh, here we go. This is a little bit more interesting than I thought it was. I mean, and like I said, there were a lot of them that materialized pretty much exactly the way that I thought they would. One of them that I was monitoring real close was the DePaul Prep Coal City game. That was what I was very interested in, and that was definitely a puncher's game. It went right down to the wire. It never really seemed like either team had total control of that game.
What's interesting about that game from where I was being at DePaul, and there are some DePaul people who are very invested in what's going on with DePaul Prep. In fact, some DePaul staffers, maybe the most important one in the athletic department, has a kid on the team that's down at DePaul Prep, heading to Central Michigan. So we were all watching that one on the stream when it got tight. So I watched the finish of that one down in Coal City. I got to say, the folks in Coal City, that field is beautiful. Yeah, I will tell you that. Good job. Good job, sports boosters. Good job, school board. You got it right. That's a building that deserves a good field like that. So that was cool to see I had no idea they had a turf field down there all these years. Is it this year the first time
Yeah,
they did it?
they just got it this year, and they did a whole reconstruction of like the whole area over there. Baseball, softball fields got a redo, everything. So, and that's a complex that was pretty good to start. So when they beefed it up in the way that they did, it made for a really nice setting. I haven't seen a game there live with turf, but I actually was driving by there one time because it's not too far from where I live.
Yeah.
And I just went over and took a look just because I was curious, and it's a very nice facility.
So kudos for DePaul going down there and winning because that's not an easy place to play. But kudos to the Coal City folks because you know what? You put on a good show for a lot of people that were tuning in to see what that looked like. And every seat in that building was taken. And that was Coal City football. That was enjoyable to watch. And just a heck of a finish. That was really a fun finish. DePaul had a chance to put that thing away. Didn't quite do it. Then they had to hold on for dear life in the last 3 minutes or so. An impressive finish to hold on and get that win. And, you know, who knew that the DePaul Prep Rams would be in a state championship game here Friday night? That's just awesome. Something we wouldn't have been talking about August or September, really, when you got down to it.
Yeah, there was just a litany of games this year. It almost fit the script for DePaul, where just a very close game. They played a lot of close football games this year, decided by a touchdown or less, decided late in the game, win, lose, draw, whatever it was. They were in a lot of those close football games. And in a game like that one, maybe that benefited them. The fact that they had been in those situations before and knew not to tighten up and knew that they just had to play through it and do what they had to do. Because, you know, as much as we talked about Coal City putting together a good situation, other than those two games that they lost, their other games were all runaways. They haven't had a lot of games where every play, you know, could swing the outcome of the game one way or another. So for DePaul, they're used to that. They've had 5 or 6 of those games already. So for them, they were in a situation that they were comfortable with and had experience before.
Let me ask you the other way. Obviously, the one that you talked about Geneva and Carey Grove. We'll get in depth of all of these games as we kind of go down class by class, but just kind of get the overall feel of which one was a blowout that you didn't think was going to be a blowout.
You know, I thought just based on past history, and I'm learning more about them as I go week to week to week here. You know, I thought Camp Point Central would give Belleville-Althoff at least a little bit better of a game than they did. And I guess I'm wildly underestimating the power that is Deere Hill Jr. because my goodness, I mean, he put together a massive game. I was looking at the state stats earlier today. That young man's averaging 18 yards a carry. That's ridiculous. I mean, that's
18 yards a carry.
Yeah, and it's not – they are a 1A team, but they did not play a 1A schedule. Until the playoffs got here, they had not played a single 1A team. Every other team on their schedule, 2A, 3A, 6A, 7A.
They beat a 6A playoff team in week 9.
Yeah, I mean, it's just – I mean –
and it wasn't close.
Yeah, they beat a 7A playoff team earlier in the year. I mean, so it's like they are everything that I think everyone is trying to tell you that they are. They are very, very impressive. And the fact that they were scoring seemingly every couple of minutes in that game, and Camp Point Central threw a couple of early punches and tried to match them, but eventually they couldn't. Camp Point Central, very good football team, but it looks like Althoff's a different beast.
We'll go through class by class here, and then I want to come back to Althoff and the implications of winning and what that does from basically a success factor and the multiplier, because you wrote some really good stuff today about that, and I was looking at it going, wow, okay. So I want to hold that thought, but let's start with 1A, work our way back up as we kind of started already a little bit with that. And how about Lena Winslow? Lena Winslow is one of those teams that's just still, I think it's amazing how they've just flown under the radar this year. Now we're going to find out, as they go in kind of, I would say, as an underdog against Althoff Catholic here in the state championship game.
Yeah, I think they are, and it's definitely kind of a weird position for Lena Winslow to be in that role. I mean, let's be honest, over the last 6-7 years,
they've been the favorite every time.
You were drawing them on that final line if you're doing your pre-playoff bracket predicting. It just you could start on that last line and build your way back. It was just as easy to do that. But Lena's a really good football team, and you kind of maybe wondered exactly how good their team was when I don't want to say they struggled in the regular season, but they didn't just knock people out like they have in past years, where they were just kind of steamrolling teams in the NUIC. But in the playoffs, they've kind of gone back to that. They've gone back to the situation where they've just kind of just rolled over almost everybody in their path and did a really, they dominated Leroy, which was something that I really didn't see happening. I thought that would probably be a Lena Winslow win, but I thought it would be a little bit more competitive than that. And once again, it looks like it a lot of times in the bracket, you're not sure if you're going to get two teams to the final. That I think were the two best teams in 1A. I think these two were the best two teams in 1A. And
I think we've been looking at that all year. Yeah, I think we've been looking at it all year as that's the matchup you want to see in 1A. Let's remember, Lena Winslow, since 2017, they've gone 31-2 in the playoffs alone. 31-2. So it's a remarkable success here. And if they can get a win over a team like Altop Catholic, that certifies their legacy as one of the greatest programs in the state of Illinois. To be very, very honest with you, if they can beat an Altop team like this. So that's what it's at stake for Class 1A. Let's go to Class 2A because this was fun. Usually 2A is kind of the forgotten class across the state here when you look down to it. Not so much last year with Wilmington, but it was kind of like, oh, Athens is here. That's nice. This year's, oh, who's that team? Chicago Christian getting there. How about the Chicago Christian squad trying to find their way through and winning the biggest game in Farmington history? How about that?
Yeah, it was definitely a situation. I was kind of monitoring that. And as the weekend has gone by, I've learned a little bit more about the Chicago Christian football team that I didn't kind of know before. This is about as close to Ironman football as you're going to get, this Chicago Christian football team. They've got 8 guys who are their listed starters on both sides of the football. They've got multiple guys who never leave the field.
It's a play-by-play man's dream.
And it's one of those situations. I was listening to the coaches conference calls today, and their coach was basically like, sometimes I'd like to take them on the field. They take them off the field. They won't let me. I mean, that's basically what it comes down to. Is this is a senior dominated football team that really, really believes in itself right now. And, this is a program that, I'll be honest with you, does not have that much of a postseason pedigree. They've now won 4 games in this postseason run. Prior to that, in the entire school's history, they had won 6 playoff games. So, that's it. That's all it was. So this is a storybook season for Chicago Christian. Obviously, they'd love to finish it out with a championship, but it's not going to. I personally don't think it's going to deflect anything away from how much they've accomplished this season.
No, and the deepest run they ever had was one time getting the quarterfinals, and then the old Driscoll Catholic Highlanders took them out, and it wasn't close. But this is the kind of thing. Their performance in the postseason the last few years. Out in round 1, 41-0. Out in round 1, 41-7. Out in round 1, 42-6. And so they get a rematch here, coming in here with, a team in Maroa Forsyth that they've seen before. They have a little tape on them. So it's a different team. And I would call Maroa the favorite just because of their pedigree and just what they've done on the field this year. But I would say the margin of favoritism is a little closer than you would even say in the 1A game.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting game. I think it's very important for Chicago Christian to kind of limit possessions here, because the one thing Maroa does like to do is play really fast on offense. They've got a lot of weapons. And, with Chicago Christian having so many guys going both ways, my concern would be if Maroa Forsyth is allowed to just run it at high octane, Chicago Christian might run out of gas. So yeah. I think it's one of those things where, how the tempo of this game is going to be very important to how it plays out.
They put points on the board for all season long. And when you have a team like Maroa Forsyth, who is good, but they got that big upset over Quincy Notre Dame, there's a little tick of motivation to say, hey, we got to finish the job here. And I know those kids are thinking about that. That Quincy Notre Dame game is long gone in their memory at the moment. But it just shows you that Josh Joseph continues to put together year in and year out really good football teams. The youth program is humming down there. Everything in Maroa, everything in Forsyth, everything is going their way. And, getting a win over our buddies down in Johnston City, they hung tough with them. They had to go in there and do it. I'm curious to see what that environment was like. I didn't get a chance to check in on that game, but, kudos to Johnston City for hanging in there and having a great, great postseason run.
For Maroa, I think a lot of it is, finally getting past that semifinal hurdle. It seems kind of ridiculous to say that. This is going to be I believe, the 9th appearance of Maroa Forsyth coach Josh Josta's coach team in a final. But for the last 4 out of the last 5 postseasons, Maroa Forsyth's gotten beat in the semifinals. So for them, finally getting past that semifinal hurdle and getting back to the title game probably takes a little bit of a weight off of particularly the coaching staff finally saying, yes, we can get back. So for them, I'm sure that they're rolling in with a lot of positive momentum and feel like they can finish the job this time.
It's amazing that he's been doing it since 2000 and 2005 in terms of the way the program has really churned out almost 250 wins now. It's awesome what they're seeing down there in Maroa Forsyth. Up to 3A now. Wilmington Montini. What happened to the Wildcats?
Yeah, it was one of those things where I felt like, they were going to have some issues with whether or not, one of their defenses was probably going to crack in this game.
Yeah.
And it seemed likely that it might be Wilmington's, and that's what happened because early Montini scored very quickly in the game and kind of put Wilmington back on their heels. And it had just felt like what Wilmington does usually, they get a bunch of stops, and then they're able to put together long drives that kind of take away, the other team's momentum, ability to kind of take control of the game. Well, both of those components kind of deserted them in the Montini game. They gave up the early score, which is something I probably don't think that they've done in years,
right,
to be completely honest with you. So they were already in the hole, already had to start playing from behind right out of the box, were unable to get their running game going kind of until later in the game. They ended up putting up decent rushing stats in the game, but that was well after the outcome was kind of in hand. So Montini, I think, just kind of physically bullied Wilmington around a little bit, which is also something that they're not really accustomed to having happen to them. So unable to kind of use the components of what they were able to do. Montini did a really good job of taking it away. And they've been doing that to teams all year long. And when they do it in their schedule, that's really saying something about the quality of their defense. That is a top shelf defense that has been performing against quality 6A, 7A, 8A programs in their regular season. I mean, only one team has scored more than 3 touchdowns on them all year. So that speaks to the quality of that defense. It's an experienced team, tons of senior leadership on that group. I feel like, this march that they've put together was kind of expected from this group. So for them to complete it by getting to the state championship game isn't really all that big of a surprise to me.
Marist scored 21 points on them in week 3. That's the most they've given up at all this season. So in any game, and everything else was tight. Fenwick, if you remember the Fenwick game, it was 14-10. That was nip and tuck the whole way too. But I want to ask you, because you've been around these parts a long time, and with Montini, when Chris Andirano left, for a while, some of the air of the program went with them. And so now we're in year 8 of Mike Bukowski, who I've always liked. I've always thought he ran a great program. He is a great coach. There were a lot of coach holdovers that stayed from that staff. They finally got over the hump to get to the state championship game. They were 12-1 in 2018, but then they went backwards, 3-6 2 times. And you're like, I don't know if this is the the way they're going to do this. And even slipping back in class because of enrollment, you weren't sure. But now you start to see that kind of building a little bit, and it just feels like Montini's starting to work their way back a little bit.
Yeah, the biggest obstacle for them in kind of sustaining was the difficulty of their schedule. Like, I mean, it became a situation where you felt like, especially when they dropped back in classification-wise, the biggest challenge was going to be whether or not they'd actually get into the playoffs.
Just get there, yeah.
If they got into the playoffs, they would be dangerous, but the problem was they were having trouble getting into the field. So once we saw, like last year, for example, they got back in and they got beat by Byron, a superpower.
Everyone else did last year.
Superpower that scored more points than anyone had in state history. So, and they almost won that game. And now this time they're following through here. Now that success is going to get them bumped back up into classification. We'll talk about that later, but it's a situation where you look at it and said, the stars have not been aligned for the program in a while, and there were various circumstances to why it slipped in the way that it did. It's nice to see them back in the situation that they're in, but they've certainly earned this spot in the championship game. Yes. This schedule was a gauntlet, no question about it. And then for them to do what they've done, especially defensively inside of that, really impressive.
And folks downstate are going to sit there and say, well, this is Chicago bias, when it comes to talking about Monticello. But I will tell you this, that was one of the best finishes that we've ever seen in the semifinals. Just how dramatic it was with Monticello getting a win over Unity, another team that Althoff was able to squeak past at some point during the season. So, when you look at what Monticello can do, I'll ask you this way: what does Colin Welter have to do to stay with Montini? Because they can put some points on the board, but they're so good defensively too.
Yeah, it's really kind of an interesting dilemma for Monticello and how they approach this game. If you look at their statistics, they're off the charts. I mean, they have all kinds of components. They can run the football, they can throw it, they can do the things that they need to do. They can score quickly if they have to. But it becomes kind of a balancing game, I think, for them, right? Because I don't think they want to get into a situation where they've got to put up 50 to win this football game. I don't know if they can, to be completely honest, against this defense. So how do you approach it? Do you just attack when the opportunities present themselves and let the time of game and all that other stuff take care of itself? Or do you kind of, hunt and peck and kind of try to piece together some drives that last for a while and work your way down the field? But then you get into the hornet's nest of, are you going to be able to do that against the Montini defense? Maybe you just got to take your shots when they're available to you, because they might not come very often.
Now, Monticello's done this before. These kids were a lot younger, 2018. So, and that sounds like, to you and I, sounds like yesterday. That's 6 years, which is a lifetime for a senior in high school who says, yeah, I remember that when they were in 5th or 6th grade. So you have to keep that an aspect of it. So there's some familiarity with just, oh yeah, we can do this. But for Welter and company, he's won state championship after state championship. This is not a new challenge for him. So the best thing they have going is the guy driving this thing in the first place, and knowing that their coaches won 4 state championships at the very least, and able to put a good game plan against a team that's seasoned like Montini.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what kind of levers he pulls in this situation, because it's a program that has had, obviously, like you just said, a lot of success, has shown a pedigree to advance deep in the playoffs. How much deference does he show to Montini in this situation? How many things does he, does he go in the bag of tricks? I mean, what does he do? I mean, he's a creative guy. I've seen this program for a long time. I mean, he's one of those guys that I think if there's something to find, he'll probably find it. So, I mean, it'll be just interesting to see, how he decides to attack this defense, because I'm sure he's aware how good it is. And the fact that he may not have a lot of opportunities to take that big hit, if you will.
You're listening to the Friday Night Drive podcast as we recap the semifinals and take a small peek at what's going to be happening Thanksgiving weekend down at Illinois State University and Hancock Stadium. Matt Rodewald, Steve Soucie with you here. Let's talk about 4A now. We talked a lot about DePaul, so we'll leave what happened with them there. Let's talk about Mount Zion, because for them to go up and get that road game and get a win and then get to go back is a big help for them, I would say, at this point in the season.
Yeah, I was trying to think of this today. I mean, we were talking a lot last week about if whether Normal University, won, then they would be very comfortable with their surroundings. It didn't even occur to me to think to myself, well, that works out pretty well for Mount Zion now that they got the win, because now they have experience.
They have the whole routine down
on the state championship field. They know what it's like. They know what it's like to be under the lights. They know the surroundings. They know the setup, and it's just like, well, that's a nice little setup for them. But and it didn't even occur to me today until the coach was actually talking about that during coaches' conference calls today. So definitely an interesting situation. This is a Mount Zion team. We talked a little bit about it last week in terms of some of the elite offensive players that they have. This is a team that I think has the potential to be very, very tricky to stop. Braden Trimble is a kid that, the old adage that is doing everything but drive the bus. I'm not so sure he might not actually be driving the bus. I mean, that he is capable of doing everything, contributes in so many ways to this football team, is so tricky to, he's a guy you have to know where he is. And the problem with that is he's not the only guy you got to know where he is. So this is an interesting football team, and it's one that has had really kind of a strange metamorphosis over the course of the season. At one point, they were 3-3, and it really kind of looked like they weren't going anywhere. I mean, they lost to Mattoon earlier in the year, a team that I believe finished 2-7. I mean, I was like, what's going on with them? And now we find them clicking on all cylinders and in a state championship game.
It's Mattoon, Soucie. They're going to come after you if you don't get it right. Mattoon. That's how you say it.
Yep. Yeah, I realized it as soon as I said it. I didn't say it right.
I'm fixing it so that the social media folks don't have to.
Yep.
So there you go. But you're right. I'm looking at their schedule too and just kind of seeing, wow, what an adventure. And to have two teams at 10-3 to kind of get there, it's kind of fun, but it's very odd to look at it. Keep in mind for both DePaul Prep, maybe not so much for them as it is for Mount Zion. These are kids that played on the state basketball team too. So this is nothing in terms of an environment that's like, oh my goodness, what are we doing here? Has our team won a state championship before? The answer is no, but we're right there. We competed at the highest level. So for Mount Zion, I look at DePaul as kind of a favorite, but I think this is probably a more even game than people think because of the fact that there's a comfort level that I think the Mount Zion folks are going to have right when they get there. It's going to be Braves Nation when they come up there for Friday night.
Well, we saw it early on that this was whatever ended up happening, we were going to have a different looking 4A final. That was what was going to happen with Rochester bowing out early in the tournament. It was just like, well, this is going to look different. We just don't know how different. And that's definitely what we've got here. We've got a team that has not been in a state championship game in 44 years, and the other team has never been in one. So, and when the other team was in that 44-year drought, they were known by a different name. So this is a totally brand new 4A final.
Let's go to 5A now and talk about the rematch of the rematch of the rematch of the rematch. Nazareth and Joliet Catholic. First off, let's talk about Joliet Catholic because I thought Morris would put up a little bit more of a fight, but I also think that this proves that Joliet Catholic is a lot better than people give them credit for, and I think they're going to be ready to go this time around.
Yeah, this should be – I think this has the potential to potentially be the most interesting state final game of the weekend. And you'd say, well, what's so interesting about it? We've already seen this thing multiple times before this, but I think that's what makes it interesting. I mean, it was a 16-13 game in the regular season. Nazareth finally broke away with a long fourth quarter touchdown pass, which is something that Nazareth can do. But, Joliet Catholic has played outstanding football in the playoffs. They've only allowed 20 points in 4 playoff games and not that much more yardage. I mean, this has been a situation where they have been absolutely stifling the other teams in their side of the 5A bracket at this point in time. So they're playing as good a football as they have all season as they head into this game. I went to the Nazareth game on semifinal. Boy, they look pretty sharp too. I mean, they really took care of business and were particularly troublesome on defense to Wheaton St. Francis. So that was a really, really impressive effort. It feels like the core of this Nazareth roster has been there for about 14 years at this point in time.
Yes, it really has.
These names are the same kids that I feel like I've been talking about forever, and they're all seniors, and they're all really, really good. Gabe Kaminsky, the Stanford commit, that kid, it feels like there's 3 of them on the field. I mean, it seems like he's everywhere.
You got to remember, like a guy like Moga Malachuk has probably played at least 19 playoff games at this point in his career, all 4 years. And Logan Malachuk, as much as I like him as a player, everyone has to remember that if Joliet Catholic doesn't lose their running back late in the first half of that state championship game a year ago, the Hilltoppers are walking out with that state title. But Nazareth rallied because of that, and they were able to get that win. And so I'm sure that's on the minds of folks at Joliet Catholic coming in. What made Nazareth so sharp on Saturday from what you were able to see compared to what we've seen them before? Obviously, they're really good, but that St. Francis team, that's an awfully good football team over there.
Yeah, I mean, they forced 4 turnovers, and that seemed to kind of really deflate St. Francis. But I'll tell you, for me, what was the pivotal situation in that game, Nazareth took a 27 lead in halftime, and I saw something that I don't believe I've ever seen. I was scanning my memory banks, and I don't believe I've ever seen this. So on the ensuing second half kickoff to start the game, Wheaton St. Francis runs the kickback. So they're down a touchdown. They're feeling really, really good about themselves. And then they kick the ball back to Nazareth. Nazareth does the same thing to them. Back-to-back kickoff returns to start the second half. Don't believe I've ever seen that in my life. Pretty sure I probably won't ever see it again. But that kind of showed that it was like, well, they're within a touchdown. Got to do something. Okay, let's do this. And then they just came back the kick. And you saw it developing, and there was like, oh, man. I mean, I don't know how big of a momentum pendulum switch it was, but it might have been one of the biggest ones I've ever seen. St. Francis feeling real good about themselves, feeling like they're back in the football game, and 15 seconds later, they're right back in the same situation they were 5 minutes ago.
I have seen it one time, and that was in 2003, Carmel at Marian Catholic.
Okay.
And, I think that was one of those 70-63 games. It was insane. I think we were there till midnight. And it was, thankfully, it was September. But I'm not kidding. We were creeping up past 11:30, still going, because it was just nuts. So I have seen it one time, but that's it. And you're right. The momentum swing, boom, the pendulum just going all over the place. Let's talk about 6A here and let's talk about Richards, because I thought Richards would do something here, and that didn't happen. What happened to the Richards Bulldogs?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes history bears fruit. I mean, that we talked about it a little bit last week. It was Richards has not done well in previous matchups with East St. Louis. And in fairness, a lot of teams haven't done a lot with East St. Louis. But, we saw it real early in the year. I think this East St. Louis team is a different breed than what we've got in the past few years. They are wholly focused on winning football games in whatever way they need to win football games. They don't care if it's flashy. They don't care if it draws oohs and ahs. They're just going to take whatever the other opposing defense has to give them, and they've got to give them something, because it's not possible to shut off all the options completely. So you have to give them something. And unlike in past years, maybe where they really enjoyed, the air it out and complete the 60-yard touchdown pass, they'll dink and dunk you to death too if it's what suits them and it's what you're giving them. So I think they've just done a really, really nice job of recognizing what the opposition is giving them and just taking full advantage of that. And that's what I think makes this team as dangerous as any East St. Louis team we've ever seen.
This is the 5th straight appearance for East St. Louis in the state championship game. 2019, they beat Prairie Ridge, doubling them up 43-21. The score gives you a whole hum feel. Then the first Cary Grove loss, 37-36 in 2021. 2022, when you thought Prairie Ridge might do the same thing? No. Instead, it was the Flyers, the largest margin of victory ever in a title game, and we saw the clock run, which I think I've never saw in Champaign before. And then last year, where you thought Cary Grove isn't going to do this again, and then 17 plays later in a 10-minute drive in the fourth quarter, they were able to pull the upset, and East St. Louis was left wondering, how does this happen to us again? They're playing a more conventional opponent in the Geneva Vikings, so we're able to get by Cary Grove. But the thing about Geneva is that the last time they were in a state championship game, guess who was there? East St. Louis. And there's something about Geneva and East St. Louis with a history where the Vikings, they've faced this juggernaut before. They've walked in with this mentality. They've played good 2.5 quarters, maybe 3 quarters of football against them before things bottom out. But they didn't have an all-American receiver and the best player I've ever seen put on blue and white before. Talon Taylor was catching the ball all over the place on Saturday. Can he and his teammates make this interesting on Saturday with East St. Louis? I have the Flyers as a heavy favorite.
Yeah, I think you're right. I hope that it's an interesting game, and I think there are some things that lead you to believe that maybe it can be, but you just look at all of the pieces that East St. Louis has, and we talked about their offense when I was breaking them down a little bit earlier.
I think their defense is better.
Their defense is better, and it was really, really apparent how good the defense was, even though it was all the way back in week 1 when I saw them live what they did with Loyola. They completely took Loyola out of that game. And you're talking about an 8A finalist right now. Granted, it's a lot different version of that 8A finalist right now than it was back in week 1. But the fact that East St. Louis's defense was able to do that, they made Loyola's offense look pedestrian in that game. I mean, I was down on the sideline. I was watching it close up. I mean, there were a lot of different things going on in that game, but that's a really, really good defense. And, I think Geneva has a fair amount of playmakers, and obviously with Taylor, they have a great one. But, when East St. Louis has so many players on defense that are playmakers and guys that can do things, I don't know how many matchup mismatches Geneva is going to be able to create, to be completely honest with you. So that's the challenge that comes into this situation. And, you look at it and say, well, they've been beat before. I mean, it can happen again. But I think this is a particularly interesting version of East St. Louis that I think just seems to have all the pieces in the places that they need to have those pieces.
Should be that one will be a good one, at least to start. I will say if they can hang in there by halftime, then all of a sudden things get interesting. But the thing is, for the Vikings, I think they need to get in a shootout. This needs to be a 1st to 60 kind of thing.
Yep.
And that's not comfortable for a lot of people. But let me add this too, and just because it's my hometown, I came back from that DePaul game in the city after the game was over. But we're talking about 7:00 at night, and the vibrance of the town and you can feel that there was a big victory and maybe a bit of a surprise to some. I think it was a little more split down the middle about belief in this one here, but that's the fun part of what we're talking about in terms of these journeys. Places like Mount Zion and their downtown Saturday night, places like even in Lombard, or if you want to go in further south, Monticello. That place was rocking after that game. And how long did that carry on into the evening hours? That's the fun part about state final football and state playoff football. So I just kind of want to point that out. And then later, you had Batavia. And let's go to 7A, because I don't know what it is about the Battling Bulldogs. We need a new nickname for them because they're more cardiac kids than anything else. Isaiah Brown with that amazing catch. That was one of the best catches I've ever seen, and that might be the biggest catch in Batavia football history.
Yeah, I was kind of following along with that game. The end of the game kind of merged right along with halftime of the Lincoln Way East game.
Yes.
So I was able to kind of follow along with what was going on, and I saw that Lincoln Way Central had scored a go-ahead score with about 2 minutes left. And before my mind's eye could even calculate what's the score and what the situation was, my immediate reaction was, they left Batavia too much time.
Too much time.
That was when I heard that it was just a little over 2 minutes. I was like, too much time. And then when I found out, of course, that they scored with, I believe, 32 or 31 seconds left in the game, yep. I was like, well, that's kind of what I expected at this point in time. I feel for both of the Lincoln Way programs that have been vanquished by Batavia in the final minute of games over the course of this playoff. It was a tough pill to swallow for, I'm sure, both of those teams. But Batavia's got some playoff magic, some mojo that I don't know if a lot of other programs have the equivalent of it. But it seems like if you're in a close game in the fourth quarter with Batavia, get worried, because it's not going to be a situation that you're probably going to like with the end of it.
It's not like it's a veteran quarterback marching you down the field to. This is a sophomore quarterback in Michael Vander, who's been on the team for what, 4 weeks, 5 weeks?
I think he joined the team fully as a varsity player in week 7.
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, so he's played basically half a season as everyone else. And the poise and comfort level for not only him, but the other 10 around him. And as I was watching the final drive, and my thought was, how in the world is Dennis Pearson talking to this kid? What is he saying? How is he keeping him calm? That's one of the greatest coaching elements that I've seen, is just throwing a sophomore quarterback in there. And they figured it out with this kid twice, and it was the exact same score, 25-21.
Yeah, it's really kind of a crazy situation. I was at the first one against Lincoln Way West, and it was funny. Like, I talked to him I talked to the quarterback after the game, and it was just like, it's okay. Like, and I'm like, boy, the wonder of being a high school sophomore, not realizing they're not realizing the significance of what you just did. I mean, and then a few weeks later, essentially doing it again. That's something special. I mean, I'm more interested now. I didn't actually see the breakdown of the game, but I talked a few weeks ago about him not having a nameplate. I'm going to seek him out and see if
Still doesn't. He does not.
I'm going to seek him out and see if he got one for the state final.
You would think you got to give him one. It's on television, for goodness sakes. You got to give him a nameplate now. Do it on Thanksgiving after practice. Come on, Dave, get that done. All right, so they go into this one against Mount Carmel, also heavy underdogs. I think the Caravan are going to roll no matter what, and I know the folks from one town, one team don't want to hear that you have one shot to stay in this game early by taking the lead and keeping this, as tight as possible. But I think Mount Carmel is one of the best teams in the state, and they've proven it once again that road victory over St. Rita.
Yeah, I mean, the last four times, playoff seasons for Batavia, this is how it's come to an end for them. They've lost to Mount Carmel. So they've, and only one of those games was what would be classified as being fairly competitive. It came down to the wire, actually. But, the other ones have not been, and I think right now the bridge between those two teams is pretty wide. It would take a pretty Herculean effort for Batavia to be able to trade punches with this football team right now. And the way that they're playing, Mount Carmel has just been flexing particularly its offensive muscle through these playoffs in impressive fashion. And I'm not really sure now that it appears that Jack Elliott is healthy. I don't really know. I'm not really sure how they're going to be able to rein that in.
All right, so I have a thought for you. All right, get ready to get the viral moment out. I've walked through this in my head, and I'm going to stumble as I spit this out. But you have Batavia, you have Geneva. Okay, they're in back-to-back games. These are rivals. If you're not familiar from around the state, they're 3 miles apart. Okay, here's my thought. I think that the Geneva and Batavia student sections should figure out a way, knowing that they are heavy underdogs against East St. Louis and Mount Carmel. They should both go down there together and make that environment as loud as possible. You think about the amount of students, 1,800 in one school, 1,700 another. Why don't we get 3,000 kids down there to make this thing insane? And you got a 6-hour party out there. Why not, right? That would be an amazing environment. Now, I don't think it would ever happen because this would require the administrations, the schools and the school districts and all that stuff. But boy, the students, they have the ability to communicate on their phones right now. I'm sure they all have friends from the other town. Figure out a way to make a 3,000 Army Tri-Cities student section and take down both East St. Louis and Mount Carmel. What do you say? Can we make that happen?
Boy, that'd be fascinating to watch if it did materialize. I'll tell you that much. It would be something that would be a remarkable thing that I think, regardless of how the outcomes of the games came out, it would be something you would remember for probably a lifetime. To be honest, be involved in something like that.
It's sacrilegious for me to even suggest this. I have Batavia friends. One of my best friends is a Batavia alum, class of '88. I think this might be the only way to kind of make sure that everyone stays in both games at this point. I don't know, but still, it'll be fun to see that environment. And even if they don't do that, and you see the students switching, after a loss, the awkwardness will be very interesting. That's the fun part about the state finals. Let's wrap up with Class 8A, and then I want to talk about what you wrote for sure. It's the best play call I've ever seen, and I had it in my head with York. I thought, just run backwards and get to the end. It's 10 seconds. They can't, even if you have to kick off, that's going to eat more time. And they actually did it. And I was so impressed with the execution of that safety play for York. It's awesome to see them break through the semifinal round and get down there for the first time.
Yeah, it was. And, when you watch that, like I heard about that after the fact, I'm like going, yeah, that's definitely a way to go. And sometimes I'm in that situation. I've seen those situations before, and I'm like, why not try that? But they had the ideal situation, an absolute speed burner there that could run around and stretch that out if possible. And it almost took a second to realize what was happening as you were watching it develop. But really kind of a fascinating thing that was going on.
It's one of those, I have a state finals sprinter. Why don't I just make sure that he runs as fast as he can and use the speed? But the best part of that play, if you watch it, because I've seen it a couple times on social media, but I watched it live too, was that he avoided 2 hits in the back of the end zone and I think he was surprised himself that he was still in play, knocking off the clock. And kudos to the York coaching staff who said they wanted to go in the fourth quarter with the ability to see the clock and the scoreboard in the other end. I don't think they had that in mind in terms of why they would need to see the clock, which is great. Loyola, you watch them face to face firsthand. Every time I think Lincoln Way East is going to get the upper hand, and that environment was probably rocking. What was it like, and what was the despair like at the end of that one?
It was one of those things as you were kind of like watching it develop. There were little nuances of the game that you didn't really even realize were happening, until you thought about it after the fact. At the time, you're thinking to yourself, when Loyola on 3 separate occasions had to settle for field goals rather than score touchdowns, you're thinking, well, that's probably a really good thing for Lincoln Way East. But they didn't get those touchdowns. But what you didn't realize at the time was there was a difference between what usually happens in Lincoln Way East games. Teams are not getting a chance to kick that field goal. I'm not even talking about touchdowns. Mm-hmm. Lincoln Way East was not getting 3 and outs. They were not taking Loyola off the field. And Loyola was getting some points. They weren't getting as many as they would have liked, but they were putting up points. Loyola didn't punt. And that was something that you didn't realize that it was happening until it happened, until we got through the game. They did not punt.
That's amazing.
Every time that they, had the football, they did something with it. They got themselves in a situation where they were kicking field goals. They did something with it. And in the second half, they showed the benefit of having to play a quality opponent almost every week that they put the cleats down on the field. Yeah. They showed the benefit of that, put together a monster drive to start the third quarter, put together another monster drive that completed the third quarter. They didn't get any points out of that. Lincoln Way East picked off a pass at the goal line, but it chewed up a bunch of clock, and it was just one of those things. And then they put the final touches on it with another long drive that just took a bunch of clock away, never got Lincoln Way East a chance to have an opportunity to get into a rhythm. And then I saw something that I never thought I probably would ever see, is Jonas Williams completed a pass with 2 minutes left in the fourth quarter. It was the first pass he completed in the entire second half. So Loyola had effectively, completely
figured him out
any offensive rhythm that Lincoln Way East ever hoped to attain. That's just as simple as it got. They forced a 3 and out with 3 incompletions on one drive. The other completion, they got a situation where they were 3rd and short and they fumbled a handoff, so they didn't get a first down. So those 2 drives prior to the pass completed with 2 minutes left, that was all they got. A series of incomplete passes and a running sequence that did not net them a first down. And that was basically the only 2 drives that they had at it for most of the second half.
2022, Loyola had to beat York and then Lincoln Way East. 2023, Loyola had to beat York and Lincoln Way East. And 2024, Loyola might have to flip it and beat Lincoln Way East and then York. And so we get to see York and Loyola do it again for a 3rd straight time. What does York have to do to make sure that they stay with Loyola as long as they can?
Well, they can't let Loyola do essentially what they did to Lincoln Way East.
Yeah.
They cannot allow them to piece together 14, 15 play drives that chew up 8 minutes of the clock and just turn it into essentially you're only going to get about 5 possessions for the entire game. And that's what Loyola essentially did in that game. They just turned it into a much smaller game in terms of offensive opportunity for the opponent. And just you look at what they're doing right now. They are imposing their will on the opposition. And the biggest key for York that I can see in this game is they just simply can't let that happen. I don't know how they do that, but that's going to be what decides whether or not that this is a competitive game. Because if they allow Loyola to impose their will, they're going to do exactly the same thing that they did to Lincoln Way East. They're just going to drive and figure out a way to get themselves in a position to put points on the board. Field goal, touchdown, whatever, and before you know it, you look up at the board and you're behind. And that's all they're trying to do at this point.
There were two things I found interesting from Ryan Fitzgerald over the course of the weekend. One, him calling out critics in a very prominent newspaper in town about how his prediction went. But the other one is what he said after the game, talking about Lincoln Way. He's not playing a four-quarter game all year. And I want to bring that to what the private schools have done in terms of their battle testing and how this relates to the multiplier and to the success factor. You wrote some really good stuff. Can you lay out that again, just in terms of it, just because it's still remarkable just to see in print, let alone hear it, about where these teams are going to fall next year. This is going to be a very different layout next year, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think the first thing you have to start with is the fact that, I mean, we ran into this a little bit last year and people didn't really fully understand what was going on. Basically, you reestablish this every 2 years. And one of the things that comes into play is that the success formula is something that the IHSA has put in place to, I guess, protect sort of against private school dominance in a particular classification. So over that 2-year period, this year and the previous year, if a team wins a state trophy, which is a championship or a runner-up in 2 consecutive years, then they must move up one classification above where they achieved that success in. So, for example, since Joliet Catholic, Nazareth, and Mount Carmel are both guaranteed to have won either a championship or a runner-up trophy by winning those semifinal games this week, they are now subject to the success formula. So all 3 of those teams will be moving up one classification next year from where they competed in having that success. So in the case of Joliet Catholic and Nazareth, they will move up from 5A to 6A. For Mount Carmel's case, they will go from 7 to 8A. And it does not matter if the enrollment numbers come out in the spring and their enrollment number says, well, they should be in 4A or they should be in 5A. Does not matter. The success formula supersedes all of that other stuff. All of it. It means that basically those schools are locked into that classification. If they qualify for the playoffs, that's where they'll play. So that's the first step in this process. There are 3 teams that are doing that. So they will move up in that situation. So then you start thinking ahead. What class is going to be pretty nasty next year? Looks like 6A to me.
Yeah.
I got to be completely honest with you. You got the existing teams that have kind of established themselves. As long as East St. Louis still elects to play up, then that makes for extremely deep 6A classification with the addition of Nazareth and Joliet Catholic. So that's the first stage in this process. Then you go to the multiplier, because that's a situation where you have to look at it and say, okay, what happens with those? The last enrollment period, we had 14 teams that qualified to be multiplied, which basically means their enrollment is taken by a 1.65 multiplier. So there's an increase that comes with that. So of those teams, 7 of those 14 are losing their multipliers. And the qualification for doing that is over that same 2-year period, you have to win at least 3 playoff games. So you look at that. The teams that are losing their multipliers: Brother Rice, Marist, St. Ignatius, St. Teresa, IC Catholic, and Fenwick. So
let me stop you there, because that's despite St. Teresa winning a state title 2 years ago.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's you look at that. No, see, St. Teresa won it 3 years ago.
3 years ago. That's right.
Yep. So that doesn't factor into this because it's only the last 2 years. 2 years ago, they were actually winless.
That's where my head was.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then this year they lost 1 game. So they will drop as well. So what happens with those teams? For example, Brother Rice was a 7A playoff team this year. They lost in the opening round. So that without those 3 playoff wins, they will go from 7A to 5A. So that's a situation right there. Marist is another one, 8A to 6A. Okay. And that's using the enrollment numbers that we have. Same thing for St. Ignatius, 8A to 6A. All right. The one that I find most interesting in this situation, I see Catholic, 4A, 2A. So they have made the decision in the past to play up. They may choose to do so again, but based on their current enrollment number not being multiplied, they are clearly a 2A team. So
exactly.
That's a situation. And then the other team that was factored into this multiplier situation that I find interesting in this situation, Sacred Heart Griffin actually was subjected to the success formula in the last 2-year packet. They were the only team that actually was. So they were a 5A team in the postseason. Not only does Sacred Heart Griffin no longer qualify for the success formula, they no longer qualify for the multiplier. So they drop from 5A to 3A. So that's something in that situation too. Keep in mind, all of these teams could choose to say, hey, no, I would rather play where I was playing. Yeah. I can play up. But by the letter of the law, as long as their enrollment number doesn't change violently, this is what will happen to those schools. Now, there's also – yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, I wanted to factor in the fact – because what I stare at is 4A, 5A now because that's where the movement is. So if I'm Sycamore, if I'm Prairie Ridge – and let me bring this up because the Fox Valley Conference schools are all losing enrollment. Every one of them, Prairie Ridge, Cary Grove, both Crystal Lakes, they're all dropping with the exception of one. My Central Rockets are going up. Everyone else is losing enrollment. So if you're Cary Grove, this might be the best thing to happen to you because everything's pushing up. And I wonder as things go on, are there enough teams stuck in 6A that would push you down and get you to 5A anyway?
Some of those vacancies are going to have to be filled by someone.
Right.
Like that's the reality of the situation. So, some of those teams, it won't change some of those teams because there are some 8A to 6A switches, which obviously means some teams are going to go up too. So it's kind of a counterbalance type of thing.
Exactly.
But that kind of gets us to the next point is while there were teams that went down, there are also teams that go up.
Yep.
We had 9 teams that are making a jump that did not have a multiplier, and now they do. So you've got some very interesting teams that are making that change. I'll run down the list real quickly here. Belleville-Althoff.
They have to win this weekend because it's not going to be as fun the next few years.
So St. Lawrence, Hope Academy, Montini, Chicago Christian, Quincy Notre Dame, Wheaton Academy, Normal University, and this is probably the most interesting one to me just because of what happens to them, DePaul Prep.
So they have to win this weekend, not just because, we got to win the state championship. I'm not sure they're going to like the road getting back there next year. Go ahead.
Well, the thing about DePaul Prep you have to consider here is back when DePaul Prep's calculation for their enrollment that they're currently using is that school's enrollment has exploded.
Yes, it has.
It has not just increased. It has exploded. It is almost 50% larger than it was the last time that we figured out these enrollments because we do it in a 2-year period. So DePaul Prep's enrollment number is going to be much, much larger before you consider the fact that they're now going to be multiplied, which they weren't before. So not only do you have that enrollment spike, you have a multiplier on top of it. And it's entirely conceivable. I don't know exactly what DePaul's enrollment number will be when the IHSA's new numbers come out. It is entirely conceivable, though, that DePaul Prep could be an 8A school. That sounds crazy, but that's the biggest. That they're going to be the largest number jumped, both in natural enrollment and then in jumping enrollment wise from having the multiplier attached. Their enrollment number now, I believe, is 833 for calculation in the state playoffs.
Right. I was just going to say that.
I believe it will be over 2,000 when this is recalculated.
That's incredible.
So that's the big story. And then looking at some of the other classification jumps just off the top, Althoff goes from 1A to 3A. Wheaton Academy goes 4 to 5. Quincy Notre Dame goes 2 to 4. Montini 3A to 4A, 5A bubble. They're kind of mixed there. So
those make sense.
Those make sense, for the most part. But that when you sort all of this out and you just kind of look at what the landscape will look like, some of those playoff fields look a lot different. It's an exercise that I will be undertaking in the off season, but just to kind of get a grips on, if we just use these enrollment numbers, how do the playoff fields look? I will play around with that because I think it's going to look pretty fascinating if you take out the factor of, maybe some of these teams will elect a playoff, but what if they don't? This is what the fields will look like. If they choose to. So it becomes really kind of an interesting machination type of thing because, like, you had a couple of teams that elected to move up from 5A to 6A to, I think, in some ways, to get away from some of those teams that were in 5A. Well, now those teams are in 6A. So what are you going to do now? So what are you going to do now? It's just like, so then it becomes kind of like, which lever do you want to pull? Which problem do you want to undertake? So I think that's going to be pretty fascinating. And I think some of this process was really, really hindered a couple of years ago by the COVID year because it was much more difficult to obviously.
Well, they held them. That's why.
Yeah, it was much more difficult to acquire 3 playoff wins when you only had 1 season to do it. Now you have 2 seasons to accumulate those 3 wins. So now that's why you're seeing a larger list of schools having to actually be multiplied because, like I said, there were 14 before. Next year, in the next pocket, there will be 18. So, it's definitely one of those situations where you're starting to see some of those programs that you're like going, they shouldn't be in that classification. Well, a lot of them won't be anymore. They will be.
Soucie, do you hear those loud cheers? Those are, I believe, those are loud cheers coming from. Let me check. Yep, they're coming from Rochelle. They're coming from Morris. They're coming from Highland and Peoria. And also they're coming from Vincennes with Morgan Park as well. You want to talk about paths opening up and possibilities? Well, there you go. Even a Bennett Academy can't get through because of these sorts of things. So it will be interesting to see. And yes, of course, Sycamore is also. And that's just looking at 5A. Can't wait to look at 4A. And I can't wait for that day when you put those fake brackets out there because I want to see what that looks like. Just tease us like a week before so we can mentally get ourselves around that, say February or so, all right?
Sure, no problem. Trust me, there's all kinds of exercises that I have to do to keep myself engaged until we get to the next season. So, and the massive 2025 schedule document that I have not started yet.
Oh, man.
You're behind. Is not enough to keep me entertained all off season. So I have to find other things to strike my fancy.
And plus spring training's in February for you. So I get pitchers and catchers report soon. Hey, we've yammered on long enough. We got to go. All right. We will be back next week to wrap up the state finals. And again, I want to see the Geneva Batavia student sections together. Let's just get weird. Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria, put them all in one student section. Please have a lot of teachers and faculty there. Just observe that just in case it gets weird. But it would be awesome to see against East St. Louis and Mount Carmel. Enjoy the state finals this weekend. I will make my way down there to watch as a fan for once. That'll be fun. Not calling games this year. I'm just going to enjoy it as a fan. So Steve Soucie will be out there. I'll be out there. And for Steve, my name is Matt Rodewald. Thank you so much for watching and listening. This has been the Friday Night Drive podcast from Shaw Local Sports. We'll see you next week, everyone.